Hi everyone, and welcome to the House of Meditation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We'll now begin the service. Let's begin the meditation service for those of you who are joining us and have a copy of the Book of Common Meditation. This is Liturgy of the Day C. C is in Charlie. If you don't have one yet, you can always go to AskSenseiTony.com and find all the books and the other information that I'll reference there, so you can follow along. If you don't have a copy of the liturgy, just follow along the best you can. Let us share the peace. May all beings awaken to that peace which is our true home. Let us take refuge. I take refuge in the ground of being within which I live and move and breathe. Let us make the accord. I take sanctuary in the heart of being, accepting all of my delusions in thought, word, or deed, born of ignorance, hatred, and greed. Let us give thanks. I give thanks for all things, awakening to the interbeing of all nature. Let us especially give thanks today for those who serve, those who provide essential needs for us during this time of crisis. May we keep them in our thoughts and minds and do whatever we can to be of service to them. And at the very least, let us offer gratitude on a daily basis. I'd also like to remember everyone who has been lost during this crisis due to this virus. And for those who are struggling, who have been infected, we also pray for their quick recovery. And we pray especially for all those who love and care for them. May my heart be open and my mind clear. May all be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and may all come to know that peace which is born of insight and understanding. Since it is the practice of enlightenment, that practice has no beginning. And since it is enlightenment within the practice, that realization has no end. Tonight's reading is from Flowers of Emptiness, a text that was composed by Dogen, a great Buddhist teacher of the medieval period in Japan. The period that Dogen was writing from was a time not unlike our own, where there was great conflict, there was great upheaval, and a time of crisis. These are the words from that text, The Flowers of Emptiness. The time and place that the blue lotus flowers open and spread are in the midst of fire and the time of fire. Let me say it one more time. The time and place that the blue lotus flowers open and spread are in the midst of fire and in the time of fire. So what did Dogen mean by this? Well, as I said just a few moments ago, he was living in a time of much greater upheaval even than our situation right now. And it was his realization that our practice, if it is good and if it is really working for us, gets even stronger in times of adversity and in times of crisis. Some people often ask me, where does the blue lotus imagery come from that we use for our school of mindfulness? And I began using the blue lotus imagery a little over 20 years ago. And at that time, I believe I was one of the first to do that, but since then a lot of Buddhist groups have adapted it. But the blue lotus flower was a symbol of both wisdom and compassion And the idea of the blooming was the idea that it would bloom within the time of crisis and adversity. So the essence of that, for me, brings us to our topic, which is how do we deal with adversity? Now, adversity can come in many forms, but tonight I'm going to talk about it in terms of stress. So a lot of folks ask me, what can I do to protect myself and my family during this crisis and during this contagion? And of course, I am not a medical doctor, and I'm not giving that kind of advice. Everything that I offer here is spiritual advice. But I can tell you that what I would do is, what my family and I are doing, is just continue as things are updated to do whatever necessary things we need to do to keep us as safe as possible. My family also has always used certain supplements to help with infections before this crisis. And some people have asked me about that, and again, I can't prescribe this. I'm just telling you what we do. We personally have always taken an amino acid called lysine, and we also take another amino acid, the acronym is NAC, and another one that a lot of people are using now is quercetin. And quercetin is another type of supplement that helps with viral infections. We swear by the lysine and NAC, but again, I don't know how helpful that would be in this particular situation, but a lot of people have been asking me what I do, so I'm sharing what I do. But please understand that I'm not suggesting that you do that or prescribing that. I'm just sharing with you what we do. So, more importantly, how can the practices of mindfulness, particularly the four-direction system approach, how can that help us with stress? We know that stress, according to the American Medical Association, is responsible for the majority of diseases and disorders that humans face. The American Medical Association associates stress as the #1 killer, if you think of it in terms of it being at the root, according to the AMA, of about 60% of the illnesses that humans face. That's a lot. Now, I don't want to go into great detail about how that works, but we do know that whenever the human being is under stress, that there are different things that occur to the body. Two things that I noted is that there's a process of chemicals that are released called cytokines. And there's also the release of a lot of cortisol in the body when someone's under stress. And this is a type of natural steroid, which also can affect the immune system by lowering, I believe, the number of lymphocytes, which is a type of white blood cell in humans and invertebrates. So we know that there's a direct effect here of stress on the body and particularly on the immune system. There's no question, that's a scientifically established fact. But another scientifically established fact is that the practices that I'm going to offer you tonight have been found to be helpful in encouraging and strengthening the immune system. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that someone who's practicing mindful living can't get sick. We're all going to eventually die of something. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that these practices have been proven to help strengthen the immune system and create a greater sense of well-being, a greater sense of well-being and happiness, and an overwhelming sense of being more at peace in the midst of adversity. So let me talk about those practices. Now I'm going to be referencing my newest book, The Three Principles of Oneness. The first principle of oneness is related to how we all suffer, and that suffering can be transformed through mindfulness into compassion. So I want to talk about two specific practices with regard to that. The first practice is the practice of being compassionate towards ourselves. Now, I often talk about this, and sometimes people misconstrue this as someone being sort of selfishly oriented. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that, but what I am saying is if you don't take care of yourself, then you won't be able to take care of others. I often use the example of that if you're on an airplane and there's turbulence and the masks drop down, which I did experience one time on a trip coming back from Japan. It's very important if you're taking care of a person who's elderly or maybe perhaps a child, that you put your mask on first. That's what the stewardess will always tell you, that you should put your mask on first. Why is that? Well, because if you don't put your mask on and you lose consciousness, you'll be of no use to those who might need your help. And that's a great analogy, because if we're not practicing these principles towards ourselves, then it's not really authentic. And anything that we attempt to share with others will lack integrity, because we're not practicing it for ourselves. So what does self-compassion mean? Very simply, it means that we learn to accept everything about ourselves. The good, the bad, and the ugly. That we learn to find a way to integrate everything about ourselves in a way that is harmonious for us. In the Four Directions system, we have a mindfulness model called Perfection and Wholeness. I refer to you for deeper study to that model. Self-compassion is about caring for ourselves in order that we might be able to care greater for others. Another aspect of self-compassion is something that is very easily misunderstood, and I'm going to talk about this in much greater detail in an upcoming podcast, based on a question that one of our Sangha members asked. And that question was about forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is a big word, and it's loaded with lots of meaning and lots of baggage from different traditions and different ideas. So let me define it for you from my perspective. From my perspective, based on the teachings of the Buddha, forgiveness is about letting go of resentment and letting go of the ways in which I feel that I have been hurt by others. So that I realize that ultimately, if I, get caught up in the ramifications of someone who has done wrong to me, or I perceive that they've done wrong by me, that it hurts me just as much. There's an old Chinese saying, actually, that if you begin to pursue revenge in reaction to a resentment or some perception of wrongdoing, dig two graves. One for your victim and one for yourself. This is a tough subject. But the point of it is not that you necessarily condone something that someone did. That's not it at all. Or that you have to forget what happened. But more, it is a practice of letting go of how it is hurting you, how it is tearing you down, how not being able to let go of those things means that you carry it probably far more than the person that created the hurt in the first place. So, two powerful ways to practice the first principle is the practice of being compassionate towards ourselves by learning how to accept everything about ourselves, learning to do that from a perspective of our true self, so that we can care for the ego self, we can embrace the ego self with compassion, and we can help it to be transformed. And part of that transformation is learning how to forgive or to let go of those things that I felt, or those persons that I felt have wronged me in the past. Remember, as I recently wrote in a blog for my publisher, Red Feather, it is not the past that creates the future. It is the present. The second principle of oneness, which relates to the idea of how everything is impermanent or constantly changing. Everything is transitory and contingent. Everything is constantly going through these great waves of change. And two practices that we can do to help us deal with stress are number one is you have to learn to confront your fear. Whatever those fears are. What happens most of the time is that people don't confront their fears. And depending on their personality, they will either hold all of that fear in, or they will express it outwardly as anger. But either way, the fear itself is what's driving the person. And we must learn, if we are to practice the path of the Bodhisattva, the way of awakening, we must learn to courageously confront our fears. Now, the best way to do that I know of, is through what we call the 4 questions of mindfulness. So during this crisis, if you find yourself confronting a fear, and believe me, we all have. Anyone who's honest will tell you that there are fears that arise. Fear's not a problem, it's just an emotion. It's not our identity. It's not a sin. It's not something to be ashamed of. Fear is just an emotion that arises from certain thoughts. So the best way for us to confront a fear, rather than to cover it over by repressing it or expressing it through anger, the better way is to practice the 4 questions. Take that situation and allow the 4 questions to process that fear and deliver you into a clear space. And it will also give you an action that you can take. Again, I don't have the time to go into the 4 questions, but you can find that in the book, Free Your Mind, the 4 Directions of an Awakened Life. The ultimate thing that we want to do, and we have the power to do as a part of this second principle practice, is we can change not only the way we think about a particular situation, but we can learn to change the beliefs that we have about something. In other words, sometimes this is spoken of as our narrative, our story. And we have this narrative or story that we build up over time. And the thing we have to do as a part of this second principle practice is confront and challenge and see if that conditioning, if that story, if that narrative is really serving us. Now, it may have served some purpose for us in terms of survival. In other words, it might have allowed us to kind of get through certain things. But we really have to ask ourselves, if there's a narrative that keeps creating suffering for us, should we continue to carry that narrative? Or should we challenge it and replace it with a narrative that is built on what we know, reality, clarity? I can tell you from my experience, both personally and as a pastor to people for the last 30 odd years, that if you can learn to change that narrative that is not helpful, everything else in your life will begin to unfold differently. You can experience truly a new beginning when you have a new narrative. I give more examples of this in my books, but it's probably one of the most powerful things you'll ever do. There was a person I worked with many years ago, I share this in the book, who was homeless. And he had this particular narrative about himself as being a loser, and someone who had made a lot of mistakes, and someone who didn't deserve to be successful. Found himself living on the streets. But he attended some programs that I offered to folks back then to teach them this way. And I saw that person a couple years later, and it was incredible the transformation had taken place. And I remember him telling me that the biggest thing that happened for him was that because of what I had shared with him, he had changed his narrative. He had changed his story. So he was no longer this loser who was living on the streets, who, because of mistakes he made, deserved this punishment, if you will. But rather he began to see himself as sort of a wandering Zen monk. And he began to approach himself differently and think differently. And in a very short time, he found himself lifted out of that current situation that he was in and moving into a bigger, more rewarding life. And I always remember that because that's the point. If he'd have kept that narrative, it would have kept him in that place. And, you know, society's always trying to keep you into certain boxes, into certain narratives that serves some other purpose, that might serve someone else's purpose. We have to learn to choose our own story, live out of our own movie. The third principle, and again, these are all ways to help eliminate the reaction that we have to stress that's so negative and so hurtful to ourselves, both psychologically and physically. The third principle is about connecting with our true self. That's the language that we use in Buddhism. Some people might say their higher self. Whatever word or symbol works best for you, it's the idea that your sense of being, your identity, is not limited to the ego self. That you begin to see yourself as a part of something greater and larger. I see myself as the very cosmos coming into consciousness, imperfectly, through this transitory vehicle that my mother and father named Tony. But that's not my true self. My true self was never born. My true self will never die. And the easiest way for me to connect on to that, connect with that, is the practice of meditation, and which we will do tonight. And so I would really encourage you, if you haven't begun a practice of meditation, that you do so. There's lots of information out there. I would again suggest the books that I have written. I would suggest that you would really strongly consider working with myself or one of our teachers to help establish a personal practice. But meditation for me, as I said in the last talk, is really about connecting with my true self. And it brings all those other principles and practices together. It begins with me accepting myself and learning to accept and forgive myself so that I might be able to let go and forgive others. It's that compassionate embrace that I experience when I sit in meditation. It's allowing myself to process things that hook me so that I might not allow them to serve as agitation. And I've changed my narrative so that I'm no longer identifying with a limited self, but I now identify with a larger, boundless sense of self. And I do that in the sweet embrace and practice of just sitting. So, these practices and principles will help us to do two things. And here's the way I want to finish this. Number one, it will help us to become less reactive. We can't avoid stress. Stress is going to happen. And I would even go so far to say that stress is neither good nor bad. And if we learn to be less reactive to the things that stress us, and we learn to use that stress to make us stronger, then we will benefit our immune system. One of the things that they've found scientifically is that short-term stress is beneficial to the immune system. Chronic stress is what hurts the immune system, and the things that I mentioned earlier. Short-term stress is it's the same as if I want to make my arm stronger. If I use a weight to stress it, I'm going to tear down muscle. I'm going to tear it down a bit so that it can rebuild and be stronger. However, if I never put that weight down, if I never rested it, well, then it would just tear my arm apart and make me weaker. It's the same thing with how we handle stress mentally or psychologically. We have to have some practices so that we can take that stress and use it short term to make our immune system stronger, to make our whole being stronger. And we will find that by doing these simple practices, chronic stress will not be an issue for us. And I know personally that it works, but you must try it for yourself. It doesn't matter what I say. You have to practice this for yourself. You have to test it and see that it works. So, going back to Dogen, the blue lotus flowers and spreads in the midst of fire and in the time of fire. The moment we receive true and trusting, solid and clear like a diamond, infinite light and life embrace and protect us, liberating us completely. Let us share the four immeasurable vows. Sentient beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Delusions are endless, I vow to end them. The ways of compassion and wisdom are boundless, I vow to embody them. The way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. Let us share together the precepts for the community of the Bodhisattva's vow. I allow my true self to manifest in all aspects of life. I take complete responsibility for my own life and all of my actions. I affirm my personal being and acknowledge it as a path to awakening and freedom. I embrace all aspects of my personal being, including my shadow, so that they may be transformed. I affirm an attitude of openness to my true self, even in the midst of suffering. It is at this point in the liturgy where we will offer incense. So I would suggest as we begin the chanting that you take time to offer incense if you have that available. And tonight we're going to chant something a little different. We're going to chant the mantra of Kanzeon. And Kanzeon is the feminine archetype of the Buddha consciousness principle. And she represents great compassion. And so we're going to chant that tonight for all of those whose lives have been lost. We're going to chant that for those who are struggling. We're going to chant that for everyone who is serving on the front lines right now. Just follow along with the chant. I will use the wooden drum, and when I hit it twice, we will finish. And then we will do some abiding practice or just sitting meditation, and we'll do that for a period as well. Kanji Zai Bo Kanji Zai Bo Kanji Zai 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 Bo always remembering that we do not practice alone or just for our own sake. Let us offer the Bodhisattva Gata. We dedicate this practice to the welfare of all beings throughout space and time. May it always be so. No. That concludes tonight's service. Again, we usually sit about 20 minutes in silent illumination, but I'm trying to be mindful of my beloved son who has been kind enough to film all of these services. And if you go to the SenseiTony.com website, all the books and references we use are there. You can also join the Sangha. You can do so by making a monthly donation. It's kind of the Buddhist tithing. We call it Dhamma. And we depend very much on your donations. So I hope you'll consider becoming part of our Sangha. On there also you'll find a weekly podcast. And then for our Sangha members, the Lion's Gaze, which is a weekly Dharma talk that I give, diving a bit deeper into practice. Blessings on everyone.